Hey, welcome to Live, Listen, Learn, a show for perpetual learning for everyone. Welcome to episode 3. I want to talk about canceling cancel culture and systemic racism. So I had said in my first episode that I want this to be about learning and me sharing my learning. And in this one, I am definitely still kind of making some claims that might be refuted. But with my subsequent following episodes and ideas for topics and things, I definitely will do a whole lot more research. So what cancel culture is when somebody like says or does something that other people don't like, and then there's like this mass like public shaming and shutting them down, and it's this big effort to like discredit and not listen to people, and it just creates this like fierce polarization in our like world right now, where you have people defending someone and then people attacking someone, and then nothing real ever gets to be talked about. And so I want to talk about systemic racism, and I'm going to get there in a second. One of the biggest criticisms that like teachers get is like the public school system is indoctrinating our children to be like radical liberal Democrats. And obviously that's a critique from a conservative perspective. And so if that's something that is happening, that's kind of almost a little cancel culture-y, where if you know that I'm a public school teacher, people already like don't want to listen to me because they think that's what I'm going to say. And if that's what you believe, I hope you're still listening. And please give me some feedback. Tell me what I can do. Because this is what I'm teaching to children, and I want to be the most objective teacher I can, and I'm still going to do that talking about systemic racism today. So as always, still just keep learning, keep listening. Maybe it changes an opinion, maybe it doesn't. And as I talk about this and everything, and I want to remind everybody, is to try to seek and understand the intention and positive message from a source or from an individual, rather than jumping to discredit it. So in this episode today, I'm going to say some things that, yes, we could poke holes in my arguments and my claims all day with counterexamples and like, you're stupid. So I want to challenge everyone in every context to look past some of that so you can find the real message behind it. Because a lot of the times opponents end up agreeing more often than we even realize. And I'm going to explain that when we talk about systemic racism today. So I'm going to add on to this idea that there are shades of racism. And if you watched episode 2, we know there's explicit racism, and we know there is unconscious bias, which sometimes can skew and turn racist. So I want to add to that. This idea of systemic racism. So in our little diagram, things that affect our unconscious bias is life. Some of the things that are going on in the background of life are things that I am going to call systemic racism. And that term is one of those things that's really triggering. And people hear systemic racism and they're like, I don't want to hear anything else. And that's because we never get past the concept of racism, and we don't actually get to talk about what it really means. And so I'm going to try to break that down so that maybe more people might understand what we're talking about. And so systemic racism is a circumstance of systems or laws that disproportionately negatively affect people of color. And all of these things, they might be happening in the background, which are affecting perceptions from the community, from my friends, from my family, and in the media, which are then still going to have an effect on the way that I think about things. And these are things that we don't realize are going on. So let's talk about the systemic circumstances. And that's one of the words that I want you to hold on to, is circumstance. So here's that definition again. A circumstance of system or laws that disproportionately, that's another important word, disproportionately, negatively affect people of color. So we're going to break this down again too. I know, lots of vocabulary, but it's both important to understand, and then after you understand it, it's actually not that important. So there's explicit systemic racism, which exists in history. So when we look at slavery and Jim Crow and segregation and voter suppression and housing discrimination. So, you know, a lot of those things, finally housing discrimination was legally ended by 1968. So by 1968, all of those things were ended. And that's also where most of our like civil rights era education ended, was in 1968 when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And then we just are sort of taught, and then everything was great. but it's not. And so this is where I am calling this persistent systemic racism, or a persistent systemic issue. And so if that word racism is the one that's getting in your way, I want you to just hold off on it for a minute and just think about them as issues. And so what it is, it's an unintentional circumstance. Again, circumstance of systems that are still disproportionately and negatively affecting our communities of color, even in the absence of explicitly racist systems. So one of those that I want you to watch for your homework is this little cartoon video that's Systemic Racism Explained, and it's with Kevin and Jamal. That's what you'd Google. I'll put it in the notes. It's a little 5-minute cartoon, and it very simply kind of lays out this idea of a history that created systemically racist situations. And it's kind of what I'm calling the wealth gap, or the generational wealth gap. Those are problems. There's not a law that says Black people can't inherit money, but there's just a circumstance where inheritance becomes limited, and not limited to everyone, but disproportionately negatively affecting people. The other, controversial topic that people are talking about as systemic problems right now is our criminal justice system. And they are talking about police brutality rates and incarceration rates. And we're just across the board, our criminal justice system is not super great. And the counterpoints, when people want to talk about persistent systemic problems, counter arguments that people will bring up is, well, there's the crime rates and Black on Black crime, and that there's more crime in Black communities. And that is why they have more violent interactions with police. And another point that people like to bring up is the welfare system. The welfare system and the welfare laws broke the Black community, and it's perpetuating poverty. Okay, so if that's what you want to talk about, I'm going to say those are still an unintentional circumstance that is not a explicitly racist law, but it's a situation that we have in front of us. This is just life. That's just what's going on. And so all of these things, they are still what I would call an unintentional circumstance. So even if you don't want to call it systemic racism, it's still a problem that we should all still talk about. And all of these things, they are shaping reality for everyone. The explicit things shaped Hazel Bryan in 1957. And the unintentional circumstances that existed make these people, like Steve King, who was a congressman for 18 years, and Richard Spencer, who is still doing his thing. So these people, these individual explicit racist examples, those are still not even the biggest point or the biggest problem. However, these are still a product of society. So maybe that is another situation that might be worth talking about. And regardless of what you want to call it, whether you recognize systemic racism as an issue, there's a problem. And whatever you call it, we're mostly talking about the same thing. And I'm gonna try to show that to you with a couple quotes here. So this first one. The issues that plague Blacks in America, or anyone that is disadvantaged, have too many factors for me to address in 8 minutes or 8 hours. But in our society, we continue to address them with actions, not with narrative. Go into communities and deal with problems by examining the roots of those problems, the foundations of problems. Start with the individual, and there are factors of education. It is right to say that there are disadvantaged people in America. So there are disadvantaged people in America. Another quote here. We should always be decent people by re-examining our biases and trying to wipe out bad thoughts we may be having about other people. It is certainly plausible that Jim Crow and slavery have affected paths in life, but how much? If we are going to change policy, shouldn't we be more focused on what are the bad policies today that specifically are keeping people down, and what behaviors we can change today to make our opportunities better, rather than focusing on slavery and Jim Crow? That's great. Let's not focus on slavery and Jim Crow. And maybe they did have an impact, but how much? And maybe we should be going into our communities and looking at policies that we can change. Both of these statements were given by kind of known conservative pundits. David Webb is a media personality. He's got a radio show and I think a TV show on Fox News. And Ben Shapiro is he works for the Daily Wire, I think. And he's just kind of otherwise like a super kind of well-known conservative pundit. And he's got something to say about everything. In any case, like Ben Shapiro's like quotes here that I pulled are from the video that he spent 17 minutes debunking systemic racism in the video that I want you to watch. And he does all of this, you know, trying to discredit and poke holes in the arguments to wind up still sort of saying what I believe is a productive comment. Like, that's what we should talk about. Let's talk about that. So remember, can we change our cancel culture into what is the real issue culture, or what did you really mean kind of a culture? And then again, just a reminder from our episode 2, give yourself permission to talk about race and some of these things, and no, you might mess up. Your homework, ask somebody how they feel about systemic racism. Is it a problem? Do they think our welfare system is a problem? Watch Systemic Racism Explained with Kevin and Jamal. It's 5-minute video. Then if you really have time, you can watch Ben Shapiro debunk it, when then also just sort of reaffirming it. Again, my claim, you can poke holes in my claim all you want, but I think a lot of us, we're still talking about and we want the same things. Thanks for listening. Thanks for learning. Please like, share, and subscribe.